The first thing Instructor Vexcon noticed about the new cadet was that she flinched when nothing was thrown at her. It happened during roll call, on the cold gray morning that started the final training cycle before the midwinter recess. Vexca stood at the front of Hall 7 with his hands clasped behind his back, reading names off a data slate in a clipped, over-enunciated trade standard that Cryek instructors used when they wanted a room full of aliens to understand they were being taken seriously. He reached the human contingent, 4 names, always grouped together on the roster because the Academy's registrar had decided, without asking anyone who actually taught them, that humans learned better in clusters. Priya Nair, a small, unremarkable young woman near the back, lifted her hand. And then for exactly half a second, she went very still, weight dropping into her knees, eyes flicking to the exits. Vexca almost missed it. He had spent 11 years teaching combat theory to cadets from 6 systems, and he had learned to watch hands and feet instead of faces, because faces lied and bodies didn't. Nair's body had just told him something interesting. She expected an attack from a roll call. He filed it away and moved on. Humans were, by every metric that mattered to a species, with a skeleton reinforced by cartilage struts and a nervous system that ran twice as fast as anything grown on a wet, low-gravity rock like Earth, the weakest species enrolled at the Varan Combat Academy. They bruised if you looked at them too hard. Their bones, according to the Academy's own physiology charts, could be snapped by a moderately enthusiastic handshake from half the other species in the building. Vexca used them constantly in his demonstrations, not because he disliked them, but because a human falling down safely was the clearest way to show a room full of eager young soldiers what correct technique looked like. You could not teach leverage on a Threk. Their exoskeletons redistributed force in ways that made most textbook throws pointless. You could not teach a joint lock on a Ossity, who did not, strictly speaking, have joints in the way the manual assumed. But a human elbow bent exactly one way every time, and a human wrist told you, with total honesty, whether you had applied a technique correctly. That honesty was Vexca was about to learn a 2-way arrangement. He did not think about Nair again until the 3rd week of the cycle, when the syllabus called for a live demonstration of the standard wrist reversal, a beginner's technique taught to cadets in their first month, designed to let a smaller combatant escape a grip from someone larger. It was, by any measure, the least interesting exercise in his curriculum. He had performed it perhaps 4,000 times in his career, always as the larger party, always against volunteers who could be relied upon to yelp appropriately and land where the mats were softest. Cadet Nair, you'll assist. She came to the front of the mat without hesitation this time, which he noted approvingly. The roll call flinch, he decided, had probably been nerves on her first day, nothing more. He explained the technique to the room in the bored, sing-song cadence of a man who had explained it 4,000 times. Grip is offered, wrist is trapped, weight shifts. Reversal is achieved through rotation rather than force. He held out his hand, palm up, in the universal invitation of a teacher who expects a demonstration prop and not a participant. Take my wrist, firmly, as instructed on page 11. Nair took his wrist. Nair, for her part, remembered the room differently than he did. She remembered 40 pairs of alien eyes on her, none of them belonging to a species whose grip strength she'd had time to properly learn, and a soft, persistent worry, the kind she'd carried since her first week on campus, that doing anything at full effort here would be read as aggression rather than competence. She had spent 3 weeks deliberately dialing herself down in every drill, worried that whatever she'd learned back home wouldn't translate cleanly to bodies built so differently from her own, and worried more quietly that translating too well would make her look like a threat in a place that had accepted her as a curiosity. Vexca had graded this exercise for 11 years. He knew in his bones, his actual breakable Cryek bones, exactly how much pressure a first-month cadet applied to firmly. It was the pressure of someone worried about hurting a superior officer. It was the pressure of someone who had read page 11 and taken the word firmly as a suggestion rather than an instruction. Nair's grip was not that. Her fingers closed around his wrist with a controlled, total commitment that turned his forearm, for one disorienting half-second, into a fixed point rather than a limb he owned. He felt his own weight get redirected before he had finished deciding to move it. He tried to execute the counter-rotation anyway, out of pure professional reflex, the same motion he had performed 4,000 times. And Kryak wrist bones, evolved on a planet with 60% of Earth's gravity, did not enjoy being asked to fight a lever that refused to yield. Something in his wrist made a sound like a dry branch. He did not cry out. 11 years of teaching had at least given him that much control over his own face. He simply stood very still for a moment, looking down at a wrist that had, with quiet and specific violence, stopped working correctly, while 40 cadets watched in silence, and Priya stood exactly where she had started, hands now folded politely in front of her, looking genuinely, mortifyingly apologetic. "Sir, I'm so sorry. I thought that was the reversal you wanted. The manual says to resist until—" "You executed the reversal correctly," Vexka said, in a voice that came out flatter than he intended. "Class dismissed early. Report to your next block." He walked to the medical wing himself rather than call for an escort, which he would later understand was a mistake, because it meant no one else witnessed him being quietly, thoroughly wrong about something he had believed his entire career. The med bay physician, a broad-shouldered ossity named Dr. Hawkris, ran the scan twice before saying anything at all. Clean fracture. Distal end of the ulna analog, consistent with a rotational load beyond design tolerance. He looked up from the display, mandibles working in the way Ascetus did when they were suppressing amusement, which was often and unsubtle. What did this? A cadet demonstrated a standard wrist reversal. On you. Yes. Which cadet? Vexka considered lying, decided it would come out anyway once the incident report was filed, and told him. A human, Hawkris repeated, and this time he did not bother suppressing anything. You let a human apply full rotational torque to a Kryak wrist joint. She was told to resist firmly, per the training manual. You know their species averages a grip strength that would crack open a standard ration tin without a tool. You have taught this exact class for 11 years. I'm aware of the species averages, Vexka said, with as much dignity as a man can summon while a doctor sets a splint on a limb that betrayed him. The averages are for arresting grip. This was applied under load, with correct biomechanical timing, by someone who has apparently trained a joint manipulation discipline since childhood. You didn't check her file before putting her hands on you. No one checks a first-month cadet's athletic history before a beginner's drill. Hawkris said nothing further, which was somehow worse than an argument. He finished the splint, prescribed 6 weeks of restricted use, and made a note in the incident log that Vexka did not read but would, months later, wish he had, a note flagging Cadet Priyaner's file for cross-reference with Earth Combat Sport records, a note that sat in the academy system, unread by the one person who actually needed to see it. Vexka returned to teaching 2 days later, wrist in a brace, and told his classes that he had slipped during a demonstration, which was technically true in the way that a demolition is technically a renovation. That night, alone in his quarters, he did something he would later be reluctant to admit to anyone. He pulled up the Academy's open archive and searched, half out of professional curiosity and half out of wounded pride, for information on the discipline Nair had used against him. He typed the words she had scribbled on her incident statement, judo, wrist reversal, kansetsuwaza, into a search field built mostly for cross-referencing alien anatomy charts, and got back exactly 4 results, 3 of them tourism guides to a country called Japan, and 1 a decade-old anthropology paper written by a researcher who had never set foot on the planet and admitted, in the abstract, to relying entirely on second-hand accounts. It told him almost nothing useful. He closed the archive after 20 minutes, told himself the search had been a waste of an evening, and did not try again. That single decision, to stop looking after one shallow, unsatisfying search, would end up costing him considerably more than a wrist. He did not, however, stop believing what he had believed for 11 years. If anything, the injury sharpened it into something closer to a grudge. Humans, he decided, were not dangerous. Priya Nair was simply an outlier, a fluke, a single cadet with an unusual background, the kind of statistical noise every large enough dataset produced. The species itself remained, by every reasonable measure, the softest thing enrolled at the academy. He had simply been unlucky, And he told himself this several times a day for the next several weeks. The way a man tells himself a stone in his boot is nothing, right up until it draws blood. What Vexka did not know, what almost no one at the academy bothered to learn, because cross-species record requests took 11 forms and most instructors couldn't be bothered, was that Priya Nair had spent 9 years of her childhood training judo in a converted garage in Pune, under a coach who had once represented her country at a continental championship. She had stopped competitively at 17, not because she'd lost interest, but because her scholarship to the academy's preparatory track had come through, and there hadn't been time for both. She had assumed, reasonably, that none of it would matter here. The recruitment material had been full of phrases like all species contribute unique strengths, and physical combat training is theoretical for most cadets. Practical specialization comes later. She had read theoretical and pictured diagrams in lectures. She had not pictured being handed a superior officer's wrist and told to resist firmly, with no context for what firmly meant to a species she'd known for exactly 3 weeks. She felt terrible about the injury. She wrote Vexka an apology note which he did not answer, and spent the following weeks trying very hard to demonstrate technique with noticeably less commitment, which made her subsequent grades on the same drills mysteriously mediocre, since half-executed judo looks, to an untrained eye, like sloppy judo. She did not know that Vexka had privately decided her file was worth watching. She did not know that Dr. Hawkres's note sat unread in a queue. She only knew that her instructor treated her, from that point on, with a specific, careful frostiness. The frostiness of a man who has decided he was embarrassed rather than wrong, and who intends, eventually, to correct the record. He would get his chance 3 months later, on the second-to-last day before winter recess. The academy emptied out slowly in the week before the holiday, the way any large institution does, administrative staff leaving first, then the younger cadets whose families could afford transit fees, until the halls held only the ones staying through break and the instructors who had, for one reason or another, nowhere better to be. Vexka fell into the second category most years, and this year was no exception. His wrist had healed clean, the brace long since removed, though it still ached faintly in cold weather, which the academy's climate control ensured never actually happened. So the ache was mostly theoretical, mostly a private reminder he chose to interpret as motivation rather than caution. He had one final combat theory session scheduled before the recess, a capstone demonstration, in academy language, meant to let each first-year class show what they'd absorbed over the term in front of a small audience of visiting faculty. It was, by tradition, mostly ceremonial. Instructors picked their strongest students, ran a clean, rehearsed sequence, and everyone went home for the holidays feeling good about themselves. Vexka had other plans. He had spent 3 months quietly building a private theory, not written down anywhere, because it would have sounded, even to him, faintly unhinged if said aloud to a colleague, that his wrist injury had been a fluke born of surprise, not of any real threat posed by the species. He believed, with the particular stubbornness of a competent professional who has been embarrassed exactly once in a long career, that if he simply controlled the circumstances properly this time, chose the technique, chose the timing, chose the level of commitment, the outcome would look completely different. He had, in effect, spent a season quietly preparing to relitigate an argument that his own bones had already lost. He selected Priya Nair for the capstone demonstration. She was, on the record, an obvious choice. Her actual grades, once you accounted for the mysterious slump after the wrist incident, were among the best in her cohort, and having her demonstrate would look, to any observer, like generous recognition rather than what it actually was. "You'll partner me for the throw sequence," he told her, 2 days before the demonstration, in the clipped tone he used for all official instructions. Standard hip throw into a controlled fall, into an armbar demonstration for the audience. You will resist, naturally, through each phase, so the technique reads as genuine rather than staged. Nair hesitated. "Sir, with respect, after what happened last time, would it make sense for someone else to?" "Are you suggesting you cannot execute a demonstration technique safely, cadet?" "No, sir. I'm suggesting the opposite." He did not understand in the moment that she had just told him exactly what was about to happen, as clearly as language allowed. He heard only insubordination dressed as modesty, and dismissed her. Then it settled. report to Hall 7, day after tomorrow, full uniform, no protective gear. This is a demonstration of clean technique, not a sparring match. We don't wear pads to show off correct form. It sends the wrong message to the visiting faculty. Nair, to her enormous credit, tried one more time. Sir, human joint mechanics, under a hip throw can generate more torque through the fall than people expect, especially if the person catching the throw doesn't. She stopped herself, visibly deciding that finishing the sentence would sound like she was lecturing a combat instructor of 11 years standing on combat. Never mind, sir. I'll be there. He should have asked her to finish the sentence. He would think about that later, more than almost anything else about that day. Word of the upcoming capstone had already spread through the instructor's lounge by the next morning, in the particular way gossip moves through a small, bored staff during the last week before a break. Instructor Fenno Dai, who taught projectile theory 2 doors down from Vexka, and had never fully forgiven him for winning the Academy's teaching commendation 3 years running, brought it up over midday rations with the transparent delight of a colleague who suspects he is about to witness something entertaining. I heard you're demonstrating against the human who broke your wrist. I'm demonstrating a hip throw. Cadet Nair happens to be executing it. That's a very careful way to describe watching someone hand you back the same injury a second time. There won't be a second injury. I've accounted for the variable. Fenno Dai raised the loose fold of skin above his eyes that served his species as an eyebrow. Which variable is that? That I resisted passively last time, out of surprise. This time I'll resist properly. You're going to actively fight a throw that a trained cadet is executing against you, in front of the visiting faculty, to prove a point about a wrist injury nobody but you is still thinking about. I'm going to demonstrate that leverage has limits against sufficient mass and structural density. Vexka. Fenno Dai set down his cup, and for a moment the mockery dropped out of his voice entirely. I've watched you teach for 9 years. You've never once let a personal grudge design a lesson plan before. Whatever that cadet did to your wrist, it clearly did something else too. Vexka did not answer, because there was no answer that didn't sound exactly like what it was, and he was not yet ready to hear it out loud from someone else. He finished his ration in silence and went to prepare the hall. The demonstration hall was fuller than Vexka expected. Word had apparently spread, in the way it does at institutions full of bored teenagers with nothing to do the week before a holiday. That instructor Vexka's capstone always ran a little sharper than the others, a little more like a real fight than a rehearsed one. A dozen visiting faculty sat along the side wall. Behind them, cadets from other cohorts had filled in the standing space. Technically not invited, tacitly tolerated. Vexka walked to the center of the mat in his dress uniform, wrist brace long removed, feeling, he would later admit to himself, in the honest privacy of his own head, days after it no longer mattered, good, confident, ready to correct a record that had bothered him for 3 months. He called Nair forward. She came without hesitation, which he read as respect and which was, in fact, resignation. The calm of someone who has tried twice to warn a superior and has decided, since the warning wasn't landing, to simply be as careful as she possibly could within the instructions she'd been given. We'll perform the sequence as briefed, Vexka announced to the room, in trade standard pitch to carry. Cadet Nair will attempt a hip throw against me as the larger combatant, to demonstrate that correct leverage overcomes raw size differential. I will resist naturally through the setup, then allow the throw to complete, and we will finish with a standard restraint hold on the mat. This shows both technique and control. It was, on paper, a reasonable plan. A hip throw was Nair's strongest technique. The coach in Pune had built her entire early game around it, and having her execute it against a larger opponent was, in isolation, a perfectly good demonstration of leverage over mass. The problem was not the technique. The problem was everything Vexka had decided, privately and stubbornly, about how the technique would end. He had decided, somewhere in the last 3 months, that his earlier injury had happened because he'd been passive, because he'd simply held still and let Nair's grip strength do all the work uncontested. This time, he intended to resist properly, the way a Kryek instructor of his standing was supposed to resist, with active counter-tension through the setup, trusting his own species' considerably denser bone structure to simply outlast whatever force a human frame could generate. He would let the throw begin, feel her commit her weight, and then, subtly, invisibly to the audience, brace against the completion of a rotation with his own core strength, turning what should have been a clean fall into something closer to a stalemate. It would look, to the room, like he had simply absorbed the technique through sheer physical density. It would, in his head, erase the wrist. It would, in his head, prove the point he'd been quietly nursing since a splint came off 6 months ago. He did not tell Nair any of this. He did not tell her, because part of him, a part he would later spend a long, humiliating recovery examining in detail, understood that if he told her, she would object again, and he had already decided he was tired of being warned by a first-year cadet about a technique he taught for over a decade. In the audience, Fenodai leaned toward the colleague beside him and murmured something Vexka couldn't hear, but could guess at from the way the colleague's eyes narrowed with sudden, uneasy attention. Somewhere in the standing crowd at the back, a cadet who had heard the story of the wrist secondhand was already recording on a personal device, the way teenagers everywhere recorded things they suspected might become worth having recorded later. Nair gripped his uniform collar and sleeve, exactly as trained. She stepped in for the hip placement, exactly as trained. And as she began to load the throw, committing her hips under his center of mass in the smooth, practiced motion of 9 childhood years in a Pune garage, Vexka did the one thing that both his own instincts, and if he had let her finish that sentence 2 days earlier, Nair's own warning would have told him never to do. He resisted mid-rotation. A hip throw, properly executed and properly received, follows a single continuous arc. The thrown party's body rotates over the thrower's hip and completes the fall along a path their own momentum has already committed to. It is designed deliberately so that a trained recipient can protect their own neck and spine by tucking through the rotation, using the fall's own energy to roll out safely. That safety depends entirely on the fall being allowed to complete along its natural arc. It does not depend on the person being thrown deciding, 3/4 of the way through the rotation, to plant his considerably denser, considerably heavier alien frame and fight the arc back the other way. Nair felt embrace. She felt the load transfer wrong under her hips, not the clean continuation of a throw completing, but a foreign, sudden resistance fighting the rotation at the exact point where a body has the least control over where its own weight is about to go. Every instinct built over 9 years screamed at her to abort the technique entirely, to let go, to step back and let 200 kilos of confused xenobiology figure out its own balance. But aborting a hip throw mid-rotation, with a partner's full weight already committed over your hips, does not simply stop the motion. It removes the last controlled element from a fall that a much larger body was already halfway into. She had a fraction of a second to choose between 2 bad outcomes, and she chose, with the reflex of someone who has practiced falling more than almost anything else, to finish the technique as cleanly as she still could, hoping controlled completion beat whatever came from letting go. Vexka's body, denser and heavier than the throw's arc had been designed around, and now fighting its own momentum in the wrong direction at the wrong moment, came down onto the mat at an angle no textbook diagram had ever illustrated, not along the safe, rolling arc of a completed throw, but at a steep, twisted vector that put the full weight of his torso, still braced and rigid from his own resistance, directly through the top of his neck. The sound the room made was not screaming. It was worse than that. It was silence, total and immediate. The kind that falls over 40 witnesses in the half-second after everyone simultaneously understands that something has gone wrong in a way that cannot be walked back with an apology note. Vexka did not lose consciousness, which he would later describe, in the flat voice of someone still processing an experience, as the single worst part of the entire event. He lay on the mat, fully aware, unable to feel anything below a line that seemed to run directly across his own throat, staring up at the ceiling of Hall 7, while a room full of cadets and faculty went from silence into a controlled, practiced kind of chaos. Someone shouting for medical, someone else physically holding back the crowd that had surged forward. Dr. Hawkers's voice, unmistakable even in panic, cutting through everything else with the specific calm of a man who has been dreading this exact incident report for 3 months and finally, furiously, gets to write it. Nair was on her knees beside him almost instantly, her hands hovering just above his shoulders, not touching, because 9 years of training had also taught her exactly what not to do to someone who might have a spinal injury. Don't move him. Somebody get the spine board. Don't let anyone move him. I told you to complete the throw, Vex-Ka managed, in a voice thinner than he'd ever heard come out of himself. You resisted mid-turn, Nair said, and her voice was shaking, but it was also, underneath the shaking, absolutely certain. You weren't supposed to do that. I tried to tell you 2 days ago. Sir, I try to tell you the fall only works if... I know, Vex-Ka said and closed his eyes, because it turned out that the worst thing about being right about something for 11 years was discovering, all at once and on your back on a training mat, exactly how wrong you'd been about the one thing that mattered. The days that followed blurred together in the particular gray texture of hospital time. Scans, consultations, a surgeon with too many limbs, and an unervingly gentle bedside manner explaining, in careful trade standard, that Vex-Ka had fractured a vertebra in his neck, that the damage had, by extraordinary luck, stayed clear of the actual spinal column, that 6 to 8 weeks of stabilization and physical therapy would very likely restore full function, and that he was, in the surgeon's professional opinion, extremely fortunate that whatever had gone wrong on that mat had gone wrong in almost exactly the one way that didn't end in permanent paralysis. Extraordinary luck. The phrase followed Vex-Ka around his hospital room like an unwelcome roommate for the better part of a week. Nair came to see him on the second day, still in her cadet uniform, still visibly carrying the same shaken quiet she'd had kneeling beside him on the mat. She stood in the doorway for a long moment before he noticed her. They said I could ask you something first, she said, before I said anything else. Are you angry at me? It was, Vex-Ka would think later, an extraordinarily fair question to ask a man who had spent the last 3 months quietly resenting her for an injury he'd caused himself. He considered lying, the way he'd lied about slipping during a demonstration, and found that he no longer had the energy for it. I don't know yet, he admitted. I resisted a throw I had no business resisting, because I decided 6 months ago that you were an accident I needed to correct. That isn't your fault. I haven't worked out yet whose fault I'm willing to say it is. For what it's worth, Nair said quietly, I don't think it's mine either. Not anymore. I spent 3 months thinking it was, sir. I'm done thinking that now. She left before he could answer, which was probably for the best, since he didn't yet have one. But the visit stayed with him longer than the surgeon's diagnosis did, turning over in his head through 2 more days of ceiling staring before Hawkris arrived with his printout and his very specific relish. Dr. Hawkris visited on the 3rd day, ostensibly to check on the healing wrist that nobody currently cared about, actually to deliver, with the specific relish of a man whose earlier warning had gone thoroughly ignored, a printout of the note he'd filed 6 months earlier, the one flagging Cadet Nair's Earth combat sport history for cross-reference, the one that had sat unread in a queue while instructor spent a season quietly deciding that his own broken wrist had been a fluke, rather than information. I want you to know, Hawker said, setting the printout on the bedside table with the air of a man placing a winning hand of cards face up, that I flagged this before you'd even had the brace off. It's been sitting in the system for 181 days. Why are you telling me this? Because you're going to spend the recess being angry at a 19-year-old cadet for something your own colleague warned you about half a year ago, and I would like that anger to have the correct address before you go home for the holiday and think about it too long. Vex-Ka did not answer immediately. He looked, instead, at the ceiling of the med bay, which was a slightly different shade of gray than the ceiling of Hall 7, and thought about a hospital garage in a city called Pune that he had never heard of before that week, and a 9-year-old girl learning to fall down correctly so that falling down would never again be the thing that hurt her. Send me your full file, he said finally. Everything. Not the summary. The actual record. Hawkris, mildly surprised, did. What Vex-Ka read over the following 2 days, propped up in a hospital bed with a neck brace and very little else to occupy him, was not the record of an outlier. It was the record of an entire species he had spent 11 years teaching without once bothering to understand. Human physical culture, it turned out, was not the thin, incidental thing the Academy's own orientation materials implied. A handful of hobbyist sports practiced, casually, by a soft-bodied species, mostly for recreation. It was across the planet's history, a vast and specific discipline of learning how a fragile body survives forces that would otherwise break it. How to fall so the impact spreads across the strongest bones instead of the weakest ones. How to redirect a larger opponent's momentum rather than meet it. How to apply a joint's own leverage against itself with an economy of force that made brute strength almost irrelevant. It had been developed, refined, and passed down for centuries, specifically because the species building it had no natural armor, no claws, no exoskeleton, and had decided, collectively, over a very long time, that the answer to being breakable was to become extremely, specifically good at not breaking. He read about dozens of separate traditions, each grown in a different corner of the same planet, each arriving independently at the same central insight from a different angle. One built around throws and joint locks, another around striking with the body's densest bones instead of its softest ones, another around simply outlasting an opponent through endurance. Most other species couldn't match pound for pound. He read about competitions held for over a century, generation after generation of practitioners refining the same handful of core principles by the thousands of repetitions, arguing over tiny variations in footwork with the same seriousness his own academy applied to shield calibration. He read about children as young as 5 being taught, formally and deliberately, how to fall, not as a party trick, but as a foundational survival skill, on the theory that a species without claws or plating had exactly one piece of natural armor available to it, and that piece was technique, practiced until it became reflex. None of it had ever been mentioned in a single lecture, briefing, or orientation packet in Vexka's 11 years at the Academy. The institution had built an entire physiology curriculum around what made humans fragile, and had simply never gotten around to asking what several thousand years of humans had built in response to that fragility. Prienaire was not an outlier at all. She was, in fact, a fairly typical product of a training tradition that had been quietly perfecting exactly this kind of technique since long before her instructor's own species had developed spaceflight. The only unusual thing about her was that she happened to be the first cadet whose training history intersected with Vexka's own stubbornness in a way that put a name and a face on 11 years of things he had simply never bothered to check. He thought, lying in that hospital bed, about every human cadet he had ever used as a weakness example in a demonstration. He thought about how many of them, unknown to him, might have spent their own childhoods in their own garages and gyms and dojos, quietly absorbing the same centuries of accumulated technique, patiently enduring a curriculum that treated their species as a cautionary illustration rather than a discipline worth studying on its own terms. The recording made by the cadet at the back of the crowd had, by the time Vexka was out of surgery, already made its way through half the Academy's internal network, passed from device to device with the particular speed reserved for footage nobody was quite willing to admit they'd watched twice. The Academy's safety board requested a copy for the incident review, and Fenno Dai, still visibly unsettled by the conversation over midday rations days earlier, volunteered to walk the panel through it frame by frame, not out of malice this time, but because he had watched it privately, alone at quarter speed, and had come away from it with a sick, specific clarity of a man watching a friend design his own accident. He pointed out the exact moment the throw's arc bent wrong, the exact half-second Vexka's core tensed against a rotation it should have simply ridden out, and told the panel flatly that the fault lay entirely with the resistance, not the throw. It was the first time in 9 years of professional rivalry that Fenno Dai had gone out of his way to defend Vexka's competence to anyone, and he did it by proving methodically that Vexka's competence was exactly what had failed. He thought longest of all about the sentence Nair had started and stopped 2 days before the demonstration. Human joint mechanics under a hip throw can generate more torque through the fall than people expect, especially if the person catching the throw doesn't, and about how he had cut her off before she could finish it, because he had already decided 3 months earlier exactly how the story was going to end. He returned to the Academy after the recess with a brace still fitted under his collar and a very different lesson plan. The first thing he did before teaching a single class was submit a formal request to the curriculum board. the first request of its kind in the Academy's recorded history, to add a mandatory unit titled Applied Human Biomechanics. Why small and breakable does not mean harmless. Built entirely around the discipline Nair species, had spent centuries developing, taught with the explicit goal of correcting an assumption that he now suspected, had cost the Academy more quiet injuries over the years than anyone had bothered to track, because instructors who got hurt tended to write slip during a demonstration in the record and move on rather than admit what had actually happened. The second thing he did was find Priya Nair in the mess hall on her first day back and sit down across from her without an invitation, which from an instructor to a cadet was itself a small breach of the ordinary order of things. "I read your file," he said. "All of it. 9 years before you ever set foot on this campus." She set down her cup carefully, visibly bracing for something. "Sir, I want to say again, I never meant." "I know what you meant. You tried to tell me twice, and I decided both times that I already knew better." He paused, choosing the next words with the specific care of a man who had spent a great deal of hospital time preparing them. "I would like you to help design the new unit, not as a demonstration prop, as an instructor's assistant with a byline on the curriculum. I have spent 11 years treating your species as an example of what weakness looks like. I would like the next 11 years of cadets to learn correctly what your species actually is." Nair was quiet for a long moment. Then, for the first time since roll call on the first cold morning of the term, she looked at him without any trace of the careful, apologetic frostiness she'd been carrying since the wrist. She was quiet again for a moment, turning her cup slowly on the table between them, before she asked the question she'd clearly been sitting on since he walked over. "Why the change of heart, sir? You could have written this off the way the last one got written off. Slipped during a demonstration." Nobody would have argued. Hawkris would have argued, loudly, for the rest of my career. Vexka allowed himself something close to a smile, the first genuine one in weeks. "But that's not really it. I spent 6 months deciding you were an exception to something I already believed, instead of asking whether the thing I believed was simply wrong. I had a great deal of time on my back in a hospital bed to notice the difference. I would rather spend the next 11 years teaching the second version than the first. On one condition, sir." "Name it." "Next time you want to prove a point against someone's technique, ask them to finish their sentence first." Vexka, wrist scarred, neck still healing, 11 years of certainty quietly and permanently rearranged, found that he could, after everything, still laugh. "Agreed," he said. "Cadet, no. Instructor's assistant Nair." "Agreed." Word of the new unit spread through the Academy faster than any curriculum change in living memory, mostly because every instructor who had ever used a human cadet as a harmless demonstration prop suddenly developed a keen, urgent interest in updating their own lesson plans before the same lesson found them the way it had found Vexka. Fenodai, who had watched the whole capstone from the side wall and had gone unusually quiet in the week since, was the first to request a seat in the new unit's inaugural session, and did not bring up the wrist or the neck or any of it even once. By the following term, Applied Human Biomechanics had the longest wait list of any elective at the school, taught jointly by a Cryek instructor with a permanent, faint stiffness in his neck when the weather turned cold, and a human assistant instructor who had, at last, stopped being asked to hold back. On the first morning of that new term, Vexka read the roll call the way he always had, clipped, over-enunciated, hands behind his back. When he reached the human names, grouped together on the sheet exactly as they always were, he watched for the small, useful things bodies told you that faces didn't. This time, when a nervous first-year cadet's weight dropped into her knees at the sound of her own name, he did not file it away as an oddity to be quietly walked around. He crossed the mat, crouched to her level, and asked her, plainly, where she trained. It was, by any measure, the least dramatic moment of his whole career. It was also, he suspected, the first genuinely correct thing he had done in this classroom in 11 years.